So first off, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking time out of what I'm sure is a pretty hectic and busy schedule. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So for gamers who might not be familiar with Hyper Light Drifter, what is the game? And uh, just give us a little bit of a background on where it came from.
It's an action adventure game with some RPG elements, and it's much in the vein of old 16-bit classics like Zelda and Secret of Mana, but modernized quite a bit. Um, so you're doing a lot of exploring, you're doing a lot of enemy murdering, collecting things,
Hmm.
and generally finding out what's happened to this world.
I was just curious, was there a reason that you went for this vein of game? Did you feel like it was, are we missing that kind of 16-bit um, era play style, or was this just a specific universe that you wanted to create, or, kind of where did where you feel like you were filling a void of some sort?
I think back when I was first prototyping it about 4 years ago, I was filling a void.
Mhm.
But now, years later, there's been other games in the same vein that have done this kind of stuff to some degree in a different way. But
Right.
ultimately, it wasn't really about that. It's mostly just this is the game that I want to make,
Yeah.
and it's derived from games that I love, components and pieces of games that I love, and media that I love.
One of the elements of Hyper Light Drifter that I thought was really striking, really interesting, was the character itself. You're always on the brink. You're walking through a map at any given moment. You might just stop and start coughing. You might be coughing up some blood or whatever. Where did this come from? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've had lifelong health issues, and I will continue to have some pretty serious health issues. It's something that is part of my personality and part of my body.
Mhm.
So being able to express and share those experiences in some way or another, and in this particular case, in the form of an interactive experience with story behind it and a character that reflects some of these um, issues that I've experienced throughout life.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's not a one-to-one, but there are very personal components to this character and to this world itself that are taken directly from my own experiences when it comes to trying to stay alive.
Mhm. And some of the other elements I saw that you have incorporated, the giant monsters, for example, at the very start of the game, um, seem to be pulled from Nausicaa. And what were some of your other visual inspirations in terms of the world that you were creating?
Um, oh man, like a million different
Yeah,
inspiration.
right. Yeah.
It's not. I think for any artist, you're pulling from everything,
Hmm.
whether it's genres or specific movies you love. Like, yeah, Nausicaa is a very obvious one, and I spoke about that early on when I was pitching the game on Kickstarter and everything. Like, that's a very strong influence because I think it's and I'm still, the best film that Miyazaki made, and has so much to say about so many different things, and made such an impressive and like world that felt real, um, and had weight to the decisions made, had consequences, like very real consequences. And when I first watched that growing up, I hadn't seen many movies like that, especially a cartoon, like with very adult themes.
Right.
And it just stuck with me forever and will always stick with me. So, yeah, like influences are infinite, really.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's obvious ones, like Zelda stuff and Evangelion, and a lot of other old anime from the 80s, especially, and some early 90s stuff. And just every game under the sun that I love influenced design decisions and even aesthetics to a degree. And like Metal Gear Solid is a big influence as far as sound design goes,
Mm.
or other old Konami games. So it's any aspect of the game, like you can trace back some key components of influence, but it's so many.
Right. And that
You're
at some
you're
point,
drawing from
yeah,
so many sources of incredible inspiration. Like it's hard to be like it is just this, unless
yeah,
the game is just a clone or something. But
right.
I think we've gone a long way to make everything our own.
Yeah, absolutely. When developing the game, and I know now it's been a number of years, and so the challenges that you've encountered, no doubt, evolved and morphed over time. But what were some of the biggest challenges that you had when developing Hyperlight Drifter? If you had to maybe call out one or two that just maybe were stumbling blocks for you in developing the game.
Biggest challenge is time management, and I think that's true for probably any project in the history of the world. But
Right. Yeah.
for games in particular, a lot of it is a guessing game. Guesstimation. Like you give your best effort to estimate how long this section of the game will take. And that section can include music, can include sound effects, can include the programming behind it, whatever systems aren't implemented yet, art and level design, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's so many variables, so many factors that go into it. And you do your best to account for those and to say, I think this will take this long. And sometimes you get it. And so, in the general time frame that you had suggested. And other times it takes a lot longer. On the very rare occasion, it'll take less time.
Yeah. Right.
But
That's like a bonus. Yeah.
yeah, but then you just spend that on other things that took longer than you'd estimated.
Hmm.
So it's, you know, games design and game development is really balancing between a science and an art. It's not as exact as you'd hope it would be, because if you're being open about design, if you're willing to iterate, which games design is all about, is iteration, is like taking an idea, putting it out there as a prototype or something, and then hammering away at it and be like, let's make it better, let's tweak it this way, let's make it better this way. Oh, we don't like how it plays now. Oh, it's prototyping, it hasn't been it's been too slow to do this component, and then we bring it to playtest and other people have feedback. So
Hmm.
it's oftentimes hard to manage time because there are so many priorities. Like everything's a priority at a certain point, and you're like, well, which ones are actual? Like, how do you prioritize the priority list
Right.
when
Everything's
there's a
never won
million?
with a bullet. Like, how do you put? Yeah. How do you put one over the other?
Right, and sometimes you just decide on the things that you want to do immediately, the things that you have the greatest desire to actually execute on, because then it'll get done rather than slog through something you don't want to.
Right.
But other times you don't really have that choice, and you're like, oh, I have to make this system, which is going to be a total drag for the next week, so that the rest of the game can function and we can move on with this phase of development. So
Mm.
time management is by far the single biggest challenge.
Right. And so Hyperlight Drifter had a very successful Kickstarter project. This was back in 2013 now, right? When the
Right,
project was running.
it's
Uh, yeah,
over 3 years ago now.
I know time flies. And at what point did you always know that you were going to utilize Kickstarter as a medium to get Hyperlight Drifter funded, or was there a certain point where you said, "Hey, like this is generating enough interest, I'm going to take it to Kickstarter"? What was that like, and then what was that experience of running the project, running the Kickstarter project like?
In 2013, Kickstarter was in kind of a bubble. There was a lot of successful projects, and people were getting a fair amount of money for their pitches. Some less, some more, and Double Fine had proved that you can make a budget happen, a more realistic budget happen on that kind of a platform.
Mm.
So I I never really relished the idea of going to a publisher for funding because I'm a control freak and I desire to have full creative control on things and even financial control. It's like I want to spend the money on what I want to spend it on because I think I know what I'm doing.
Right.
And so Kickstarter was in the back of my mind when I was early in development on this, when we were just prototyping as just myself and Bo. Um, and I never really had plans to reach out to a publisher. I thought about maybe other like private funding, but it seemed like the best route. And there wasn't any traction because nobody knew who I was. I hadn't shown it to anybody except for a handful of friends. And then I just put it up one day and it kind of took off. So,
Mm.
it was, uh, it was an attractive enough pitch that it ended up driving a number of people to it and pulling it way into the limelight in a way that I didn't expect.
Yeah, and that in the aftermath of that, then did you find, because you weren't really expecting it to take off the way that it did. I mean, it ended up, I think, at around 650,000 or something like that at the end of the project. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, about 645.
yeah, around there. So I'm sure that you didn't go into it expecting to get nearly that much. And so, was there a point where you felt that you were going to lose some of that creative license because now your project kind of rested in the hands of all these people who had funded it, or did you feel like you were still able to maintain that control over the project like you wanted to, just with the added benefit of this extra funding?
I didn't feel like I lost any creative control at all. I felt like I had gained much more creative control because now I could hire more people
Mhm.
and I could do the things that I actually wanted to do on a larger scale. Like the project, as it was pitched, was going to be a much smaller thing. But as soon as I started to hit the 100 200K mark, is like, oh well, now maybe we can start pulling some people in. And by the time it closed out, I could put together a real team for this,
Yeah.
and start to flesh out the vision in a way that just wasn't possible before.
Right.
So backers, our backers have been really great overall and really understanding because we delayed a couple of times, and
Mhm.
I just canceled the Wii U and the Vita ports, and they're very understanding about that. Um, and I think that's because we were always very transparent. Like I post updates every month, sometimes a little more, um, and I try and be as straightforward as possible. Like here's what's going on, here's where we're at, here are the things that I'm feeling, here's our energy levels,
Right. Yeah.
here's every step of it that we can reveal without undermining the vision of the game, because some developers live stream their coding or whatever else. Like we weren't going into that
Yeah.
depth, but we were really saying like this is the phase we're in right now, and this is what we're preparing to do, and we'll go to this show now, and like these are our estimates for these things for release or this part of production to take, or et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
So our Kickstarter backers, again, they've been very good overall, and I don't think anybody demands creative control over it on the Kickstarter side, at least from our end.
Yeah.
Um, they feel like they obviously have some part in it, of course, because
Mhm.
they influence it, because they donated money to the cause to make it a reality. But there are components of the game that we had pitched way back in 2013, like bosses or whatever else, that just changed into something else, or got cut because there was better content we wanted to do, or because they didn't fit quite right. And we actually ended up making a much bigger game than we thought we were going to make, and a much bigger game than we had pitched, even.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there are still some people who are like, where did this content go? Like, where did this boss go? And they're like, are you ever going to put that back in, this cut content? And I'm like, what are you talking
Yeah.
about?
This game
Have you
is like
played the
mini.
video game?
Yeah.
Like we
Yeah.
put so much fucking work into this and so much content,
Yeah.
because we didn't put this one boss in there, you're unsatisfied. Like, dude,
Yeah.
that was 3 fucking years ago.
Yeah.
That was a different game in many ways, and that was a pitch for a game that's $27,000.
Yeah.
And some of the stretch goals were like, yeah, this region will be here and this region will be here, and those regions made it in, albeit in different forms, different labels, and we didn't even have labels in the end. So it's like, how can you say that region's not in there if there's no text in there to tell you what the region is?
Right.
So it's just, games change over the course of multiple years of development, and you can only hope that they change for the better. And in our case, absolutely 100 million percent they changed for the better. Like there are ideas in that pitch or whatever else that we completely ditched. Like we had a shield in there and we fucking threw that away. We
Right.
had this shitty boss with a dog and we tried that out and we're like, no, this sucks. Let's make a different, better boss. We had this idea for a level that we'd labeled out in one of the stretch goals for like this toxic area that would rain down on you. It's like, wow, that doesn't work at all with the world that we're building now, and like with the story component over here. So let's do something way fucking better that actually fits.
Yeah.
So I think the thing is, people are starting to get a pretty solid glimpse into how games are made. And as this being my first game, like I'm getting a very solid glimpse.
Yeah.
I'm getting a firsthand
You're like, oh,
experience
this
into
is how
how
it goes.
games.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I've heard the stories about this stuff too, and I had an understanding before I dove into this. Like games change all the time. Like
Yeah.
you know, I'm a huge games nerd, and I'd read as many articles as possible and talk to other developers and whatever else before I launched this. So I had some inkling of this, but yeah, it's learning all this stuff over the course of the past 3 years. Games change, and sometimes games change drastically over the course of development. I mean, sometimes they meander, sometimes you already have very solid ideas, but like the core and the spirit of Hyperlight of what we had pitched from the Kickstarter is there. And the majority of the things that we were like, this is going to be in the game because we really like this part are there. But other things that were like, hey, this is a cool idea, we're going to put it in, changed because
Right.
it just didn't fit anymore. And again, like we made a we made a game 2 or 3 times bigger than we thought we actually could, with way more content than we actually thought we could. So I have no qualms about changing stuff because it was always for the better.
Yeah.
Getting rid of the shield was after three
So it
months
was
of
like an
trying that
off-brand
out.
shield, like
Right.
a Dark
It's
Souls
like,
type of
yeah,
sword and shield.
that was part of the pitch was the shield, but nobody
Yeah.
really complains about that going out the door. It's like, no, it didn't fit the game. We did something better.
Yeah.
Um, so
Reflect shots with your sword and shield dash. That's all you need.
Right. So it's like any game out there, it will change over the course of a long-term development cycle.
Yeah.
And we were doing it for 2.5 years, and so of course we're playing with ideas and experimenting with levels and lore and changing and altering things, and
Yeah.
it was always for the better. So I think most people understand that. And again, I think it's good that people actually see that this is how games are made. Things get changed, things get cut, things get added, things all over the place stuff happens. And the other big thing too with the most recent like cancellation announcement for Wii U and Vita,
Right.
well, super disappointing for us as well. I think most people understand because there are limitations. I have very real limitations for my health, and the team has very real limitations as a capacity for developing a game for more than a few years. Like that stuff can really wear on you after you've been grinding on it for a long time,
Right. You get burnt
and
out. You get burnt out
you
after
get
a while.
really, really burnt out.
Yeah.
And that's a very real thing in the games industry where there's a huge amount of turnover. And people leave companies all the time. I mean, Bungie's a good example just recently. They have hundreds of employees, but, just in April, a bunch of people, they reorganized and a bunch of people left and created their own studios and everything else because they're just burnt out on grinding away on this game for years because there are long hours and because you're doing the same thing over and over because games are fucking crazy to make.
Yeah.
Even a small game is insane to make. Like, it's a crazy man's project.
Yeah.
Movies are one thing where it's like, sure, you have a lot of components to it, but they shoot everything in a couple of months. They do post effects later. It's like different phases for different people, and it's much more streamlined after decades and decades and decades of doing this stuff. Whereas games, like you have sometimes thousands of people working on any individual game, and because they're so big, and because the budgets are so massive, and because they have to meet these deadlines, like there's just huge amounts of crunch, and people are just done with it or leave the industry. Like I know so many people personally that used to work in AAA or in larger projects and are just like, fuck no, I'm never doing that again.
Yeah.
Because it was like, while it was my dream when I went in there, it's like, oh, I'm gonna go work for this company that I love, and then you discover like, while I'm just another cog in this giant machine, and I'm worn down, and my life has suffered because of it, and I'm not happy anymore. Even though I'm working on this project that I love, I'm just being worn down.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting. Like you mentioned, like being a cog in a machine, and the strange thing, and why I feel like people get burnt out is not only are you a cog in a machine, but if you don't do your job as that cog, the entire project can be delayed, right? Like if you're doing coding or whatever, if you're supposed to hold up this end of the development and you're not delivering, then that can delay the game, and you can still basically be, like, hey, you're not doing what you need to get done, like it's time to go.
sure,
You know what I
and
mean?
then there's guilt
Yeah,
associated with that as well.
absolutely,
But I think
absolutely.
on larger teams, there's less of that because they can divert resources more easily. Whereas on smaller teams, if you're not living up to your side and you're a programmer or whatever, then yeah, there are very real consequences to that are much more dire than on, say, like Bungie's team, where
Yeah,
if a developer who was there ends up leaving mid project or whatever for whatever reasons, they can refill that role. It might not be ideal. It might not get done as fast, or it might not be done as well, but it'll still get done in one way or another because they have the bodies and they have the money to pay for the talent. But in an indie team, it's, orders of magnitude much more important that people carry their weight. And even on the indie side, people get burnt out because you're crunching and you're crunching and you want to make this happen and this is your shot. So, it's fucking hard to make games. It's perspective, and
Right.
I think one of the biggest the biggest things to realize for the general public, for people who are not in the games industry, to realize is like most games just don't get made, and you never really used to hear about that because publishers would quietly kill projects that were in prototype phase or whatever else, and even deep into production, like
Right.
before they were announced or whatever else. And on the indie side too, like games get made or they don't, or it's like, and you just never hear about it. Games of all sorts are incredibly difficult to make, and a lot of them don't get made. And I'm glad that people are at least, even though there's like a negative connotation to some Kickstarter stuff now because of failed projects and because of very high profile failures and
Right.
just disappointments and whatever else.
Mighty number nine. Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah, I'm not very fond of what happened to that Kickstarter. I don't think it went very well, but um, there are realities to the games industry that Kickstarter has brought to light. And for better or for worse, I think it's for better that more transparency is actually available now to everybody. Um,
Yeah.
and that people, again, instead of like armchair game designing or business decisioning, they're able to see kind of the inner workings of the stuff to a degree. Again, you're never going to get a full picture of it until you actually make a game, but at least there can be more understanding from other people rather than just criticism.
Right. And I think one of those things, I mean, an educational opportunity that you were mentioning when it comes to the Wii U and the PS Vita cancellation is around porting. Because I feel like, again, to the general public, there's this idea that to port a game, it's not that hard. Like
Right.
you just you made it on the PS4, you just kind of reskin it and you release it on the Xbox One, and that's what you do.
Yeah, the
But
question the
yeah,
question is often like, why can't you just put it on this platform?
right.
And it doesn't matter what platform it is, porting is difficult. Um, you usually have a lead platform like a PlayStation these days or a PC. And that's a lot of work in itself just to get a game out on one of those
Right. We
platforms.
were just talking about that. Yeah, making a game itself is difficult. Then add porting onto that. It's yeah.
Right, add porting onto that, and you have months of extra labor, at least, if not more, just to optimize for that platform, just to get everything up to snuff for the requirements for Sony or Microsoft. Like, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little things you have to be aware of for each platform, for each region. And then the hardware is different, and then there's bugs, and there's QA, and all the things that you did on your first platform, you have to redo on this, plus a million other things. And it may not even work very well on that platform because your engine's not made for it or not optimized for it. And then you have to go back in and tear out a bunch of code or redo a bunch of code. Like it's been this way forever. Now, yes, it is easier than ever to port to a PlayStation or an Xbox.
Right.
That doesn't mean it is easy.
Yeah.
It was always incredibly hard. Now it's just
You're still
really, really
pushing a
hard.
It's a smaller boulder, but you're still pushing a boulder up a hill.
Right.
You're still doing that.
It is a humongous task, an undertaking. And it's why you still see big massive studios like you see that the latest Batman game just flopping around on the PC for months because in whatever happened behind the scenes, who knows? Because everybody's under NDA and legal ramifications if they talk about this stuff very openly.
Right.
It's like whatever happened there. I can't imagine that the studios that got saddled with porting this ever said like, yeah, let's just do a rush job and throw it out there. It's there are timelines, there are deadlines, and you do the best you can sometimes, and with the resources you're given. And sometimes you have a big publisher breathing down your throat and saying like, you need to release this at this time. And there are plenty of cases where it's like you go through QA and you're like, this is not done. It needs more time, and you can see when things release before they're actually done.
Right.
Um, and it's sad, but it's a reality of the games industry, especially when it comes to bigger games and bigger projects, because they have quotas to meet because they're like, we have a marketing campaign, we have all these things lined up. It doesn't matter. Do what you got to do. Like cut this thing here, or just release it as is. Whatever bugs, we'll patch it later.
Yeah.
And in the case of again Batman, like I don't know. Maybe it's because its lead platform was like PS4 or something like that. It didn't perform very well on PC for a lot of people. And again, like I highly doubt that the teams that got hired to help port that on the PC were ever like whatever to this project. I'm sure they gave it their best, and you only have limited time. And if you only have limited time and there are big issues, it's you can't do anything about that. You just need more time. And so you saw after the release, after enough complaints and returns and whatever else,
Right.
they finally they like Warner Brothers is like, all right, we're gonna take the time to patch this up, and it took months. It took months to patch that thing up to get it working for the vast majority of people, and that is a lot of time. But that's probably the
After a
time they needed.
disastrous release too. I mean, like, not only
Right,
did they have to go back and fix it, they spent, and again, you were talking about like the people that are part of these studios that ported it. They gave it their best. They were trying the best with the deadlines they had, only for it to be released to widespread scrutiny and like insults and everything else that came with the
right.
PC release of the game. That, yeah, there was some blame directed at Warner Brothers, but a lot of it, of course, is directed at the company that ports it over, the people, like the
Which
developers
is
themselves.
unfortunate,
Right,
and I
right.
think potentially unwarranted
Yeah,
because yes, there are some scummy games companies out there, or like really low end ones that don't do good work, or what. Like there's a whole spectrum
yeah.
of
You
them,
find that
but
in any industry, like that's a, yeah,
sure,
yeah.
there's a whole spectrum of good and bad. But like in the case of Batman, it seems more likely it was the publisher really bearing down on a deadline here, and just pushing through a game that simply wasn't ready to be launched on the PC for a mass audience.
Yeah.
So I think it's unfortunate the kind of outlash and that is derived from this kind of a scenario. But I understand it. Like I understand the frustration and saying like I bought this game, I pre-ordered it, I was super excited for it. It doesn't work on my PC. Fuck you. Like I get it.
Yeah.
Sure, I would be mad too. I was upset to a degree because I pre-ordered it also, but or didn't pre-order, but I bought it also, and it didn't run very well. And but I also understand and am sympathetic to the fact that it's more complicated than that. It's not just this company sucks. Fuck you. It's hundreds of people working on this stuff, real people that care about this, and sometimes the situation is out of their control. Oftentimes they have, again, limited time and budget to do this stuff and can't fight the higher ups on a big marketing campaign and a deadline that they need to absolutely 100% meet regardless of whatever bugs are in there. So
Right.
it's it's it happens all the time, and that's just kind of the realities of games development.
Yeah. Um, so just to kind of wrap up, what's next for you? I don't think that we have any official announcements or anything yet. Are we working on any new games? Are you taking Hyperlight Drifter to any conventions coming up? What's next for you and for Heart Machine?
Well, we're wrapping up Kickstarter stuff for Hyperlight. We have an art book coming out and some other rewards to fulfill by the end of the year,
Mhm.
prints and things. So I'm trying to get that stuff out as quickly as possible now that we have our console builds out, now that we did our big patch for Steam, and we're getting that worked out for the rest of the platforms. And then there's always new things happening, and I won't talk about those for quite a while.
Okay, got a while to wait. All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time again to chat with us and shed a little bit of light on your work with Hyperlight Drifter and everything else. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, no problem.